Right before the link service, I'll say builder services add HTTP context accessor. I think this is a big drawback of the ASP.NET Core dependency injection system. In reality, you should be getting warnings like this at compile time rather than at runtime when you try to start the application and you only then figure out that you can't resolve your services. Nonetheless, let's start the application and test out our HateOS implementation. I'll send a request to get back a habit based on the identifier, which I already have here, and I'm certain that this habit exists. So when I send this request, we get a response back, and if I expand the response body, you will notice that we have our links present in the response. So this is how easy it is to implement HateOS in an ASP.NET Core application. You can see that the href fields all have fully qualified URLs to our API, pointing to the correct base address and then the URI of our resource. If I copy the value of the self-referencing link and send a request, I'll get back the same response. Conversely, if I want to update it, I can use the provided href value and the correct HTTP method in order to send a request. I will have to reference the documentation to see what is the request body, but typically it will be safe to assume that you can use the representation that you have available, which is right above the hypermedia links. Using these hypermedia links, the client application doesn't need knowledge about how to construct the URIs where they can send requests to. They also don't need to know which HTTP methods to use. All of this information is present in the hypermedia link that your API returns. Now, if you were paying attention, you might have noticed a subtle bug that I introduced in the current implementation. Let me try to introduce support for data shaping in this request by introducing the fields query parameter. And I will send this request, and we do get back a response. Our data shaping is working as before, and we also get back the hypermedia links in the response. But if you take a look at the self-referencing link, you will see that it's incorrect. There is no query parameter present for the fields, only the base URI for this resource. And this isn't really the correct hypermedia link to return in this example. Luckily, the fix for this is very simple. You just include the fields in the route values that you provide to the create method on our link service. And now if I start the application again and we resend our request, you'll see that we're getting back a response with the correct hypermedia link that also includes our data shaping parameters. So now I can take this URL and send a request, and I will get back the same value. Now, in case of the other hypermedia links, for updating, partially updating, or deleting a habit, we don't need to provide the data shaping parameters as they aren't part of the respective URI. Now, one more thing you should notice is that we're not specifying the resource ID in the URI. In other words, there's no ID value that's returned as the representation of our resource. However, we can include it in our hypermedia links, and this is how we make our API self-discoverable. The clients don't even need to know what the ID of our resource is. They just need to know how to reference our hypermedia links and use them to execute the respective operations on the REST API. Now, one thing that is worth discussing here is if we take a look at the response headers, and I specifically want to focus on the content type. The content type of this response is application JSON, and what we are returning isn't really application JSON. It does contain JSON in the base response represented by our resource, but the hypermedia links wouldn't fall under application JSON. So what we could do in this case is introduce a custom media type, and this is something I want to discuss in our next lesson, but I just wanted to bring it up from the start so that you are aware of the media type mismatch that we currently have. So we implemented support for returning hypermedia links for a single resource, in this case in the endpoint for returning a habit. Now let's refactor this and extract it into a method, and I will call it create links for habit. Let me create this method, and I want to move it to the bottom of my endpoints because I always place the private methods near the end. This will allow me to reuse this method if I want to include the hypermedia links in another response. And a good example of that is our create habit endpoint. This endpoint is using the habit DTO as the response that's returned after creating a new resource or a new habit. And the simplest way to implement support for HateOS is to include a list of link DTOs. So let me add the link DTO reference, and I will call this links. Now, if I go back to my controller, inside of the endpoint, right after creating my habit DTO, I can go ahead and say habit DTO links, and I can assign the result of create links for habit. I need to specify the habit ID. I can use either the habit entity or the habit DTO, it doesn't matter. And for the fields, we're going to specify null because we don't want to perform data shaping. Now in this case, it looks like I made a subtle mistake by using init instead of set for my links property. So I'll go ahead and fix that. And I wanted to show you something interesting in the create links for habit method. It's returning an array, and here I'm expecting a list. And if you aren't familiar, C# recently got collection expressions, which is what I'm using here to initialize my array. So I can update the return type to be a list of linked DTOs, and I can update the type of this variable to be a list of linked DTOs. And I can still continue using these curly brackets here to initialize my collection. And now this will compile. I just need to update the type here to be a list, and now both of my endpoints are working. So let me start the application, and we're going to see if HateOS is working properly when creating a new resource. I'll send a post request to create a new habit, and we get back a 201 created response. If I take a look at the response body, it contains my resource representation, but it also contains my hypermedia links. And this is how someone can get started using our API. They first create a resource, and in the response they get a representation with the possible links that they can use to continue working with the API. So now they can either get the resource again, they can update it, they can send a patch request to perform a partial update, or if they aren't happy with it, they can go ahead and send a delete request. So this is how we can support HateOS for a single resource. Now what about collection resources? Let's go to our endpoint for returning a collection of habits. This endpoint supports searching and filtering, data shaping, pagination, and all of this is something that we can express using hypermedia links. Now if I take a look at the response, you will see that it's actually a pagination result. And it already contains some metadata about the response. We're going to use this when constructing our hypermedia links, but another question to consider is whether we should include hypermedia in our data-shaped response that we have here. Let's tackle the collection of resources, which is our items collection, and note that this is a collection of Expando objects, but the underlying type is our collection of habit DTOs that we extract here. And what's really critical to consider here is what is the information that's required to properly construct the hypermedia links for a single resource. If we take a quick look at the helper method that we created, create links for habit, it relies on the presence of the habit identifier. So keep that in mind. Now inside of our getHabits method, we may provide some data shaping parameters where we exclude the ID. So if we only try to rely on the presence of the ID in the Expando objects that we get back after performing data shaping, then we might be missing the critical piece of information that's required to create the hypermedia links. So we have to figure out a way to create our hypermedia links before we perform data shaping. So let me show you an interesting way how we can solve this. I'll expand the shape collection data method to include an additional argument. This argument may be optional, so I will make it nullable if you don't want to support data shaping, and it's going to be a function that takes in one entity instance represented by my generic argument and returns back a list of linked DTOs. So this function should know how to take in my entity and turn it into the hypermedia links for this specific resource. So let's call this the link factory, or better yet, links factory, because it returns a collection of linked DTOs. And then how we can use this is when iterating over our resources, I can say if links factory is not null, then I want to include the hypermedia links as part of my Expando object. So I can say shaped object and specify a links key, and inside of it I can call the links factory and pass in my entity. Back in my controller, I can provide this function here, which is going to take a habit, or in our case, a habit DTO, and I just want to call the create links for habit method. So I can pass in the habit ID, and we can pass in null for the fields, but this would disregard our data shaping arguments. So what we actually want to do is to pass in the query fields parameter. Let me align this vertically so that you can see everything. And now this will allow me to include my hypermedia links even in my data-shaped responses when I omit the resource identifier. So let's go ahead and try this out. This is the request I want to send to my getHabits endpoint, and I'm including the fields that I want to get back for each resource. The name, status, is archived, and created at date. So if I send this request, you will see I'm getting back my response that contains my resources in the items array and the pagination metadata, but each resource is also properly data shaped. So it only contains the fields that I specified in my query parameter, and each resource also contains the hypermedia links for this specific resource. If you take a look at the URI, you can see that it contains the resource ID, and this value is different for the different habits that I'm getting back in the response. And again, the most interesting part here is that I'm not including the resource ID as a field that I get back in the response. It's present in my resource representation, and if I want to get back this specific resource, then I can send a GET request to this URI and obtain this specific habit. Now, what are we going to do about the hypermedia links on the collection response itself? We could include some very useful hypermedia links to fetch the next or the previous page of habits without the client having to know how to construct the actual URL. To be able to support this,